Hello everyone, Lee Fried here, and today we have possibly one of my favorite books of all time in terms of philosophy and self-help. It is The Undiscovered Self by Carl Jung. C.G. Jung, Carl Gustav Jung. And so just quickly about Carl Jung, he was one of the fathers of psychoanalysis, along with Sigmund Freud. And there are some people who draw a line as to who they prefer in terms of their style of psychoanalysis. So right off the bat, I'm very much a huge fan of Jung and not a terribly huge fan of Freud. In fact, I don't like Freud at all. My grandfather didn't like him, and there's many jokes about him being sexualized or sexualizing others. Freud's main basis for everything is that there was a sexual problem or sexual explanation for every problem. And it's all about going into the trauma and rehashing it in the psyche. And the one difference, I think, between Freud and Jung, perhaps, I'm not sure if this is a huge factor, but Freud was Jewish and Jung was Christian. So each one of them, I think, had a slightly different aspect, and I think their religion might have influenced that to some extent. Anyway, Freud kind of came up with the whole Oedipus complex. He took Oedipus Rex and said, aha, this is a natural inclination, that people have a natural inclination to kill their fathers and marry their mothers, and that's something that just needs to be wrestled with or accepted or something. I haven't read any of Freud's works, but that's my surface level understanding of his stuff. Jung, however, was much more interested in psychoanalyzing not only people but groups. And as we'll see in this book, what Jung kind of ended on, what he was obsessed with, seemingly, is dreams and dream symbology, and how we can interpret dreams. And it's funny because that's a running thread in the Bible, that the interpretation of dreams is something only the prophets can do. So there's a funny commonality there. In any case, one of the things that I think Jung did, I'm not sure if Freud did this as well, but essentially he was asked in the post-war period to psychoanalyze the German populace and say, how did this happen? I mean, we have the political, economic, social explanations for why the war happened, but what's the psychological reason? And as I recall, Jung basically said, well, it's like the destitution of Germany in the 1920s just destroyed the country so completely that it just was reduced to nothing. And from that, the people were kind of left with their subconsciousness exposed. And from that, it's like the spirit of the German people rose up. And what that spirit was an Odin-like figure, that it was this great Valkyrie or warrior that rose up, and that's what led the German people into war through Adolf Hitler. And that's kind of what I remember it being. And so he kind of did this whole big brain analysis and also had his own practice. And it's funny, there are some interviews of him on YouTube where it's all in black and white, but they interviewed him in, I think, the 50s, I think. But yeah, really was the father of psychoanalysis. He's one of my favorite people. He understands the mind and I think the keys to mental health, which is something that a lot of people seem to struggle with these days. And so I feel like focusing more on Jung rather than Freud's methods, it's helped me, honestly. It's helped me understand myself and my archetypes, and my the structure of my psyche, of my mind, has aligned more with Jung than anyone else. Jung had basically, you had the self, the super self, and the shadow. So the self is you, and the super self is kind of like your consciousness, And this is kind of like telling you what's bad, what's wrong, you should or shouldn't do that, your moral compass, basically. And your shadow is this really cool concept that, you have your shadow. It's part of you wherever you go, but you never really notice it, especially as an adult. You're just like, yeah, the shadow is there. My shadow's, well, I have a bunch of lights here, but my shadow's, I guess multiple places. But the shadow is essentially an aspect of your mind from the subconscious, which Jung usually describes as an ocean, which I think is a great imagery. And so the shadow is something that is all the thoughts that we are unconscious of, and the shadow is ourselves that manifests those unconscious thoughts, and while the self is the conscious thoughts. His goal was to confront the subconscious with the conscious, the self and the shadow, and to merge the two. You see this very directly in games like Persona 4. I love the Persona series, and the way they display the shadow. I read this and then I immediately played Persona 4 after, because my friend was like, hey, remember that game? Yeah, they have shadows in there. I was like, oh yeah, Persona 3 had shadows too. Anyway. But it's exactly that concept. If you want to expand your admiration for Carl Jung, I play Persona 4, but it's also a great game. Anyway. And so part of that was not only saying, accepting the things about you, that your insufficiencies, like I'm not sure if he coined it, but things like projection. You see someone who is fat and lazy or is greedy, and you think, oh, how could they? And you realize you only recognize it so quickly because you realize that in yourself. You're like, ah. So it's taking all of these things in our mind that we're not aware of, that are percolating down here, all of our biases, all of our hidden thoughts, our assumptions, basically, and kind of confronting them and not exactly challenging them, but really awakening to them, that be like, oh yeah, I do have a bias towards low-fat milk or something. I do have a preference for vegetables, or I do like walking on this part of the sidewalk. And it's really a level of consciousness where you're raising it. And a lot of this book is kind of defining what is consciousness. When you're a child, you're not really aware of what you're doing. You're very much dependent on other people. And until you grow up and you realize all the embarrassing things you did as a kid, you realize you can judge that and be like, oh yeah, I would not do that. But it's weird that you were that person, and suddenly you became a person that could think and perceive yourself and realize, oh yeah, I'm doing these actions. I shouldn't do them, or I should do them. And things like, people would have nervous tics. They would, play with their fingers, or, do this or something. And it'd be like, why are you doing that? Why are we doing that? Should we do that? Should we find a way to reflect our own behaviors and change them in turn? And that's the heart of psychoanalysis. 90% of the time, we might have a weird tic, we might have a weird thought, a weird idea, a weird idea of looking at the world, and sometimes that's useful. If you're an artist, if you're a director, if you have a certain way of thinking, it can be useful and beneficial, in which case you don't need a psychotherapist. But when it's not beneficial, when it's bad, when it's disruptive behavior that is socially unacceptable or damaging to yourself and your own private life, if you're depressed and anxious, Jung was like, there's a way to treat that. There's a way to find out why we feel the way we feel, deconstruct it, open it up, and then fix ourselves. Anyway, quickly before I go on, Freud's model, just because you'll recognize these terms, is very similar. But Freud, I believe, was German. So he used German words for the same concepts. So, for example, ego. Ego in German just means self. We kind of have a negative connotation to it. I don't know if that's Freud's intent. But the ego just means self. I don't see self as a highly negative thing. Like, you need the self, you need that. There's a very funny, not expression, but a contrast, that we have expressions in the English language like, take care of yourself, which is positive, and you're so selfish. as if doing for yourself too much can be a bad thing, and it can. It's like pride or arrogance. If you take too much pride in yourself and you become selfish in a negative aspect, then that affects that's a negative thing. It affects yourself. But we don't have a great vocabulary in the English language to talk about self and the psyche. The Greeks had lots of different words for love, at least, and the Greek word for mind, I believe, was psyche. Either soul or mind was there. The dealer said psyche. And it's a weird thing that we think of the soul and the mind as two separate things, and the psyche is like an in-between. But in those days, they were the same thing. Your mind is your soul. How you think is how you are. So you should think good thoughts, obviously. But not everyone can. That's difficulty. In any case, so for its model, you have the ego, the superego, and the id. And the superego is just the super self. So same thing as Jung, but his lower area, his dark area, id, that's German, and it just means it. And I immediately think of the Stephen King novel, It. And I think the whole plot of that book by Stephen King was that whatever his name, the clown, he manifests as different terrors and horrors depending on the person's perception. So someone was really afraid of clowns. I don't remember if I'm misremembering that, or if that's just a very poorly explained or poorly done trope or something. But basically it is the subconscious. And I think the twist in that thing is it was like an alien from outer space or something really dumb anyway. But the it is a thing that is the part of ourselves that we don't want to face. It's similar to the shadow, but I think in Freud's case, it's more of like the shadow of the unconscious and the id are the same thing. It's not like it can manifest as a part of us. It just is this abyss. And I think that's where if you stare into the abyss, the abyss will also stare into you. But it's the idea, if you look into our own nature, that we are capable of doing awful, evil things. And part of it is accepting that and learning how to love ourselves despite that. And how we don't want, even though we're capable of these things and we can see these awful things we can do, we don't allow those things to manifest in our sight, in our consciousness. Someone cuts you off on the highway, you get a bad thought about what you want to do to them, but you don't do it. It comes from the id. It comes from a primal place of the brain. Anyway, there's kind of slight differentiations between these two. The last thing that Jung mapped out, which I think is worth noting, is the animus and the anima. If you are a man, you have an anima. If you're a woman, you have an animus. And that is your ideal partner. And your ideal partner is so my anima is a beautiful, nice, generous woman. And she exists as a part of my psyche, of my imagination. And it's kind of like I look at potential mates and partners and I try to think, okay, how well does she fit that archetype? And this isn't something I'm consciously doing. This is just something I naturally do, and everyone naturally does. Is she the one? Is he the one? The one that fits the slot in my brain. Anyway, something Jung points out that I think is worth noting, that's great advice in general, is that when he deals with a patient, he says something in here along the lines of, he only ascribes 50% of the analysis to his demographic. So if his patient is a 40-year-old married man with a child and a high-stress job and with XYZ medical conditions, the amount of bias that he will allow that to take place in his analysis is only 50%. The other 50% is his personality, his own personal thing. So it's very much, you can't judge a book by its cover. I know you're a woman with these attributes and blah, 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 but it's like nature and nurture. I can see what you are, but who you are is something we need to discover, and that will factor in the other half of how I help you. If you're a teenage girl who's depressed about her body image, that is not unusual. That is very typical, and the kind of help you would give is typical help. If you have a kind of self-esteem issue, and you're a 40-year-old man and you have a self-esteem issue of a 13-year-old, that's when what you are isn't as important as who you are. That there's something about you that is unusual for your age group and your demographic and everything. You shouldn't be having these issues at this stage of life. I think a lot of young stories, and he does give some anecdotes about his patients, but also in general that a lot of people's issues really around things like OCD, things like self-image, not in a physical sense, but someone's like, oh, I wish I was more successful in my job, I wish I was happier, etc. Things like this. And it's like figuring out, okay, why do you think that? Can we get you to fix yourself or find some way to do it? This was the beginning of things like exposure therapy too. Oh, oh, you're scared of frogs. Here's pictures of frogs. Face your fear, and that's something that even I think Jordan Peterson said. So it's something that it's I mean, again, psychoanalysis is like a new field. It's like started in the 40s and 50s, and now it's like normal. But from a historical context, it's very new. I need to share the story that there was some like Jerry Springer or Lori episode where some woman was terrified of pickles of all things. And so what do? They bring out a giant plate of pickles in front of her and she screams and runs away. Very entertaining. Not sure if that's the therapy she needed. But apparently exposure therapy does work in small doses and increments. If you're scared of monkeys, you look at a picture of a monkey, then you go to like a 3D model of a monkey. Maybe then eventually the final part, you go to a zoo, maybe you go into a cage with a monkey, and you eventually get over your fear. That seems to be how a lot of phobias are dealt with, is just through exposure and just being like, oh yeah, this isn't that bad. Anyway, I'm rambling on. He talks about how the state and the political state can have its own quasi-personality. The war and the Nazism could have been avoided if more people self-actualized as an individual. And so he really saw the danger and damage of communism and Nazism and other social programs throughout the 20th century to create these highly collectivized movements where it's like, okay, everyone is going to fall in line and do their bit and fall in line and do their cause for their bit for the cause. And so he said that this happens on I'm kind of munching it here, but like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You have like physiological needs like food and shelter, social needs, self-esteem needs essentially in there somewhere in the middle. And then after that you have self-esteem and then self-actualization, which is like, yeah, I don't need other people to be happy. I know who I am. I know my identity. I've developed it. I've refined it. I know what I like. I know what I don't like. And I'm an individual that isn't going to get swept up by a social thing. And that's how a lot of these National Socialism or International Socialism swept up a bunch of people, because it was that midpoint in the hierarchy of needs that was social pressure. And the implication was that a lot of people didn't develop their selves beyond this part. And so when the government comes and says, hey, we're all going to do this thing, fall in line, all the people at that level of psychological development fell in line. They just said, okay, yeah, no, sure. If we're all dancing, wearing red scarves and silly hats today, then that's what I'm going to do. And they had the need, it's a psychological need to fall in line and do what everyone else is doing. And Jung is like, if you awaken to your subconscious and you understand the archetypes of the sea of your unconscious, and you understand yourself and yourselves, you won't need social validation because you'll understand yourself. You won't need to be reflected in other people like a weird mirror to get the validation that you need, that everything is inside. It's within. And one of Jung's famous quote is that he who looks inside awakens. And so this all ties in also with religion to some extent, that you are discovering yourself, discovering the God within, the complex of your thoughts, why you believe what you believe, whether you believe in God or not. Why is that? Why do you believe? What is your highest truth? What is your highest love? What is the thing you value most? And is it you or is it something else? How do you value yourself in comparison to other things, other ideals, and other people? And these are the questions that we ask in psychology, I think, or that's the impression I get from this book, to understand ourselves so we don't have to talk to other people. We can look within and see who we truly are. And once you see within, you're going up here to the top of the pyramid and you're good. And it's interesting because he brings in Christianity as a beneficial thing and that it helps in this process, but also that our modern interpretation of Christianity is not what it used to be, and it's actually detrimental in some states. I'm going to read this part from you so you can get a better understanding. A religious symbol that comprehended and visibly represented what is seeking expression in modern man might possibly do this, but our conception of the Christian symbol to date has certainly not been able to do so. On the contrary, the frightful world split runs right through the domains of the Christian white man and our Christian outlook on life that proved powerless to prevent recrudescence of an archaic social order like communism. This is not to say that Christianity is finished. I am, on the contrary, convinced that it is not Christianity, but our conception and interpretation of it that has become antiquated in face of the present world situation. The Christian symbol is a living thing that carries in itself the seeds of further development. It can go on developing. It depends only on us, whether we can make up our minds to mediate again and more thoroughly on the Christian premises. So it's interesting. He's kind of saying that Christianity at its current point in, I would assume, is a Protestant context from where he grew up, is insufficient for analyzing and understanding our world, in the sense that you have the Orthodox Church, the Catholic Church, the Protestant Church, and I guess now the Mormon Church. You can argue even Islam is a branch of Christianity with all of its Christian characters in it, that we need to have another kind of spiritual or religious revolution that revitalizes and renews the tenets of the religion, and that we're not using it the right way, which is something I personally agree with, and I think is very interesting to say that, this is an institution that has survived for 2,000 years and has been the bedrock of the height of civilization, and suddenly it's all outdated. And I was like, is it really outdated, or is our interpretation of it outdated? And I think there's something here. I think there really is something to that we just might be going over the things in a wrong manner and not devaluing it, but misvaluing it, misunderstanding it. And he talks about how, you have creeds and principles of society which promises freedom, but freedom ultimately comes from the individual. The self-interest of the person is rooted in individualism and not in social congruence. Even though you can have slogans which promise such things, ultimately the nature of an individual is going to trump social credences and programming, for lack of a better word. The dictator state has one great advantage over bourgeois reason. Along with the individual, it swallows up his religious forces. The state takes the place of God. That is why, seen from this angle, the socialist dictatorships are religions and state slavery in a form of worship. But the religious function cannot be dislocated and falsified in this way without giving rise to secret doubts, which are immediately repressed so as to avoid conflict with the prevailing trends towards mass-mindedness. The result are, as always in such cases, is overcompensation in the form of fanaticism. So he's basically saying that, all these religions, most egregiously socialism, where apparently everyone is equal, for some reason erect giant statues to their leaders, Lenin and Stalin, in this seemingly paradoxical state. Well, I thought everyone was supposed to be equal, even the leaders. Well, no. And so by removing God, especially in the communist Russian context, you have these statues and the deification of these men, of Lenin and Stalin, rather than God. And he's basically saying the issue with that is that now the state, you can't argue with the state, you can't argue with God, essentially. If you are a religious person, you might fall under the same spell and problems with your priest or your minister or your imam, where you give all your allegiance and thoughts to this person. But even in that context, it's kind of like God is still something in the Protestant tradition that you have a direct relationship with. You don't need anyone to tell you what to do. God speaks directly to you, and you can interface with him directly, and you don't need an interpreter. But when the state is God, when the people with the guns and the army and the resources are God, they have total control over you. You deify Hitler or Stalin or Pol Pot or whatever, because they remove the symbols of belief and replace it with themselves. You can see this in any dictatorship, really. And it's funny that because people see that it's not really a divine perfect system, the doubts, because something perfect cannot really exist in reality. Something perfect only exists in your mind. Utopia, the whole point of utopia is that, and I think it's a Greek word, and I believe it means a place that does not exist. The whole point of utopia is that it is impossible to achieve. That if it was achievable, it would be too perfect. It wouldn't work. And there's lots of other literature on this, but it's so funny that when you realize something isn't perfect and you're so bought into it, the secret doubts, almost like buyer's remorse or sunk cost fallacy, actually makes you more fanatical. If you pledge allegiance to this thing and the thing has issues, and you feel this doubt that it's not what you actually want, it actually makes you defend it more. And you can get very insecure. I don't know, some guy buys a Lamborghini and it's not that good, and he's like, oh no, it's the best purchase ever, because I don't know. But you get the idea. But it's interesting, he notes that there. And so it's a similar theme I've seen in a lot of other media, where in a world of conformists, you want to be an individual, but you don't necessarily want to be a rebel. You want to be someone who is part of that society, embraces its values, but also puts forth your own, or also goes further than the other people. And I think that's what Jung really wanted. He wanted a country or a culture of individualists, of people who could get along, obviously, but also would pursue their best interests and the interests of the future, the things that people don't think about, that they can't be given because they haven't happened yet. It's funny, he also talks about ancient religious or spiritual rites in ancient cultures, and how they act as magic. And he says magic can just be rephrased as psychological insight. And it gives a feeling of security and absoluteness. And it's funny, all the symbols of the church or the state, all of these fanfares and signs and everything, like they're just inanimate objects, but it's the thing they represent that creates the symbols and the purpose and the values in a psychological context. So there's psychological tools really to enforce the power of the state, the validity of a claim, the devotion of someone's love, all these things. And so parades and state fairs and all things like this enforce those ideas. And he says it's funny because a lot of these symbols don't mean anything. They're just all whatever, but it's such a profound insight that these irrational actions and symbols have sometimes more meaning than actual physical things, like the idea of donating to the Red Cross than buying yourself a burger or buying a burger for someone else or something. It's a symbol that energizes and feeds our souls and awakens the symbols in our subconsciousness. And when you see it manifested in reality, it has an effect on you that you begin to follow that thing or believe in that thing. And then he gets, okay, so this is really cool. So he says that, the subconscious, it's an ocean. You can't see it. It's dark. It's murky. It's pitch black. And the only things that arise from it that have shape and form are things of pure essence, pure envy, pure greed, pure love, pure charity, pure desire. And these things take on the form of what he calls the ultimate type or the archetype. These pure form thoughts, or as Plato would call it, pure forms that symbolize a specific idea or emotion or thought. And he believed that these things would appear as symbols, usually in dreams. Western man is in danger of losing his shadow altogether, of identifying himself with his fictive personality and the world with the abstract picture painted by scientific rationale. His spiritual and moral opponent, who is just as real as he, no longer dwells in his own breast and beyond the geographical lines of division, which no longer represent an outward political barrier, but splits off the consciousness from the unconsciousness man, more and more menacingly. Thinking and feeling lose their inner polarity, and where religious orientation has grown ineffective, not even a god can check the sovereign sway of unleashed psychic functions. This idea of losing the shadow, of losing our connection with our inner selves and losing our identity with it, and having our self or our ego fall into this inner ocean, is a very terrifying idea. That if we lose a sense of ourselves, we will never be able to deconstruct our own archetypes, our own versions of ourselves. Something I really love seeing in media is when, you have the devil and the angel on your shoulder, but when it goes beyond that, where you have 5 or 6 different versions of the main character, one is not just good and evil, but one is lazy, one is funny, one is dumb, one is smart, and all these different shadows or variations of yourself all exist as like a part of you. They're other pieces of your psyche, and it's such an easy thing to visualize, but we don't do it that often. And I just think there's something about identity, especially now, where it feels like identity is such an important and at the same time such an unimportant thing, that there's only certain ways you're supposed to identify and other ways you're not. And I think to Jung's horror or dismay, he might say that today we're choosing to identify as things that aren't true or aren't really versions of ourselves, or that whole self-exploration is being squandered or quieted or something and repressed. And I don't know, I think there's nothing worse than growing up and having a trauma or an unresolved issue or past thing in our psyche that we have guilt or regret over, and we're not conscious of it, and it just sits there and molds and manifests. Yeah, I don't know. I just want to get rid of all the negative thoughts, or deal with our negative thoughts in a more productive manner and understand ourselves. It's funny, he draws the line between animal nature and divine nature, like the parables and the styles of Jesus. What is natural to us and what is natural to the divine, which is not natural to us, because if we were naturally like Christ, we wouldn't need to be like him. And trying to find that balance between what is good and natural, but also what we need to change about ourselves to be better. As his consciousness has broadened and differentiated, so his moral nature has lagged behind. That is the great problem before us today. Reason alone is no longer sufficient. Saying that intellect, reason, sophistry, argumentation is no longer sufficient for moral, spiritual claims in a seemingly increasingly less spiritual, less religious world. It is the nature of political bodies always to see the evil in the opposite group, just as the individual has an ineradicable tendency to get rid of everything he does not know and does not want to know about himself by forcing it off on somebody else. It's interesting how that black-white, good-evil nature in ourselves is also seen in political parties and dealings, that everything you hate about yourself or about evil, about the world, can be shifted into one group. Great art will not flow until now, and has always derived fruitfulness from myth, from the unconscious process of symbolization which continues throughout the ages, and as a primordial manifestation of the human spirit will continue to be the root of all creation in the future. And this is so important what Jung says. He's saying that the symbols that appear in our dreams and the symbols that appear in foundational myths are the things that give our life meaning, which is exactly what Joseph Campbell took from and adapted and wrote The Hero's Journey. These are the patterns and the symbols throughout our myths and our stories that have granted us meaning and purpose, and will continue to do so because they tie into the basic human nature which supersedes every society, that we are born with these inherent feelings and desires and ideas that we aspire to be. And that's only all the first part. The second part is dreams and symbology and interpretations thereof. Oh, by the way, this is the pacing of it, the spacing of it rather. It's only about 100 pages. I definitely, obviously recommend this a lot. It's very interesting to read. I think it's imperative, and I think it's relevant to today's situation. So it's very, very good. This interview talks about the United Nations and NATO and their respective symbols and how they use those symbols to propagate the ideas that they want to create. There's also an interesting story here about cryptomnesia, or the concealed recollection, may exhibit a strange or otherwise remarkable characteristic to another story. And it's funny because who he quotes here, right here, is actually Nietzsche and his Thus Spake Zarathustra, about him descending into hell as his ship was sinking, and it corresponds to an actual sinking of a ship in 1686. This is an odd thing, and he called it cryptomnesia, where sometimes you'll write something, and this really has nothing to do with psychology. Well, it kind of does. You'll write something, And either by coincidence, it completely replicates this other event that you had no prior knowledge of, or it was an event you had read before or previously in your youth or something, and you rewrite it as if it's part of your creativity when really you've taken it, you've plagiarized it, but you don't even remember that you have plagiarized it because it was in your subconscious when you were so young, like a children's story. And then, of course, the next degree of that is that you do actually plagiarize and do it consciously. But what Jung was interested by this is that there are stories and symbols and things that are in our subconscious that appear to us and say, oh, I've never seen that before. And this is an underlying issue that we learn our lessons, we learn as humans the things we should and should not do, and then we forget them and we fall into our old behaviors. And it's like, how do we retain that? And his kind of thing as well with this symbol. You see the symbol, you remember, you recall all the important information and lessons and morals and whatever about that symbol, and that will do you, it will serve you well. And then the rest half of this book really is about the language of dreams, trying to interpret what a snake means, what a voyage means, a bicycle, etc. And he says an issue with dream interpretation that a snake as a universal symbol is going to mean something different in every culture. There are some East Asian cultures that revere the snake as a apex predator, while in the West it's seen as a Eden-like deceitful figure. And there's also that one person might just like snakes, or they might think snakes are gross, or they might think snakes are sexy, or something else. And so there's always never a universal way to approach one-to-one dream interpretation. Here he relates archetypes, and he calls them the primordial images, the absolute essences of the boar, the snake, the human, the witch doctor, the priest, the warrior. Similar to tarot cards in a way. Also, he has this very strange anecdote about this little girl, and she has these dreams that are about a snake-like monster with many horns that kills and devours all other animals. But God comes from the four corners, being really four gods, and gives rebirth to all the animals. And it goes on through this almost like Revelation-esque style of dream. And the only thing that they knew about this girl is that she was Swiss and very, very sick. And before he could question her further about her dreams and their meaning, apparently she passed away a year later, which is a very odd thing to happen to a very odd girl who was having dreams about the end of the world. He also says that in the past and former times, men lived their symbols rather than reflected upon them. The soldier had a sword. It was his purpose. The scribe had his pen. The man has his wife, and the wife has her husband. You know, the wife has their children. The man has the plow. The wife has the cooking pot. You know, all of these items and images, we live through them, and now we're all kind of removed from that area. We now have different technologies and different ways of thinking, and we no longer have the purpose symbols that gave us meaning. It's just something that we reflect on and say, ah, yes, rather than fully embracing the images because they're not part of our daily lives anymore. Here at the end, it's interesting. Jung says the man has become humanized. He no longer hears God and the thunder, demons and snakes, spirits and rain and ponds, and he takes everything as a purely material understanding, and the spirit of things and magic no longer exists in his perception, that everything is just made of atoms and is what it appears to be, and that there's nothing deeper beyond it. Anyway, he goes on to talk about all of these things in detail, but this is one of my favorite books of all time in terms of self-help. It really awakens you to think about your own mind and the archetypes of it and the shadow and the super self and the anima, and he doesn't get into this in this book, but things like the child self, the God self, how you can perceive your different selves. From Stoicism, from Marcus Aurelius telling us that we can change what we think about our minds, and jumping to this as like, okay, we can change the device, but this is looking inside the device and seeing all the little gears and symbols and how it all works. And this is kind of the next step in my kind of enlightenment, if you will. Very powerful, very enlightening, and very short. I recommend this one. And yeah, anything Carl Jung has said or done is almost always very interesting. Anyway, as always, guys, I will see you later, and keep reading.